Somewhere in America, in the winter of 1930, an old man sat in a cold room and did the arithmetic of his own survival. He had worked his entire life, decades of it. His hands were ruined, his back was bent, and his body could no longer do the only thing the world had ever paid him for. There was no check coming at the end of the month, no pension, no savings that the Depression had not already swallowed, and there was no government program of any kind waiting to catch him. There was only a question, cold and simple. What happens to a man in America when he grows too old to work and has nothing left? For most of this country's history, that question had no comfortable answer, and the answer it did have was one that most Americans today have never heard. Today, nearly 70 million Americans receive a monthly payment they treat as permanent, inevitable, almost a law of nature. It arrives whether the economy booms or breaks. For millions of retired people, it is the floor beneath their entire lives, the difference between dignity and disaster. Most Americans cannot imagine growing old without it. They assume it has simply always been there, woven into the fabric of the nation like the flag or the Constitution. It has not. For the first century and a half of the United States, there was no Social Security, no monthly check for the elderly, no guaranteed income for those who had grown too old to labor. A worker gave the country 40, 50, 60 years of his life, his youth, his strength, his health, and when his usefulness ended, the government offered him nothing at all. So how did they survive? How did the elderly of an entire nation live out their final years with no pension, no safety net, and no promise that they would not simply be left to starve? Before you hear the answer, ask yourself something. Do you believe caring for the old should be the duty of a person's family, or the responsibility of the whole country? Hold that thought, because the way America finally answered it was born out of fear, desperation, and a revolt almost no one remembers today. The easy assumption is that the past was gentler, that in the old America, families simply took care of their own, that aging grandparents were folded into warm households, rocking on porches, surrounded by children and grandchildren who considered their care a sacred duty. It is a comforting picture, a nation of strong families needing no help from any government. But that picture hides a darker truth. Because for millions of aging Americans, growing old without money did not lead to a porch and a rocking chair. It led to a place they spent their entire lives praying to avoid, an institution so feared that its name was spoken like a curse. A destination that haunted the imagination of the old, the way few things ever have, the final address of those who had nothing left and no one to take them in. The people of that era even had a phrase for it, a grim little saying passed from generation to generation about the fate that waited at the end of a hard, unlucky life. It was not a joke, it was a warning, and behind it lay real buildings, in real towns, filled with real Americans who had worked their whole lives and still ended up there. Hi viewers, when you grow old, would you rather depend on your own family to care for you, or on the government? Tell us in the comments. Your answer is the very question that once divided this entire nation. To understand how it all changed, you have to understand the world that came before, a world where old age itself was a kind of quiet gamble. If you had land, or loyal children, or a rare stroke of good fortune, you might end your days in comfort. But if you had none of those things, if the factory used you up, if your children moved away or died young, if a bank collapse erased your savings, then the country you had helped build had almost nothing to offer you but pity and a bed in a place no one wanted to name. And here is the part that would astonish most people today. America already knew how to solve this problem. It had, in fact, already done it once before, on a massive scale, decades earlier, pouring an enormous share of the entire federal budget into supporting hundreds of thousands of aging citizens. The machinery had existed, the precedent had existed, and then the nation had simply let the memory of it fade, as if it had never happened at all. So the mystery only deepens. If America had already built a giant pension system once, why did the elderly of the 1920s and 1930s find themselves facing the poorhouse with nothing? Who had forgotten? And what would it take to force a country that prized self-reliance above almost everything to finally guarantee its people a secure old age? The answer would not come from a president acting out of pure generosity. It would not come quietly, or easily, or from the top. It would be forced upward, out of the desperation of ordinary people, ignited by a retired small-town doctor whose radical idea spread across the nation like wildfire and terrified the most powerful men in Washington. And when the change finally came, in the form of a single law signed in the summer of 1935, it would carry a hidden price. Buried inside the promise of security for all was a deliberate compromise, a quiet decision that would lock millions of Americans out of the very protection the nation was celebrating. Most of them would never know why. This is the story of how America learned to grow old, of the feared institution that shadowed the final years of the poor, of the forgotten pension system the country erased from its own memory, of the uprising that dragged a reluctant government into action, and of the bargain, struck behind closed doors, whose consequences still echo through American life today. It begins not with a triumph, but with a fear, and with a place at the edge of town that every aging American once dreaded with all their heart. To understand the world these Americans feared, you have to walk out of the city and into the countryside, back into a nation that was still, for most of its history, a land of farms. On the American farm, old age had an answer written into the soil itself. A man worked his land through his strong years, raised his children on it, and when his own body began to fail, those children took up the plow. He did not retire, not in the way we mean the word. He simply did less and less and less, moving from the fields to the porch to the fireside, always surrounded by the family whose survival was bound to the same few acres. The land was his pension, his children were his security, and his place in the household was guaranteed by a simple, hard fact. He owned the very ground they all depended on. It was not gentle, exactly, but it worked. For generations of rural Americans, growing old meant staying home, staying useful, and staying under the same roof as the people who owed you everything. And then America changed, faster than almost anyone alive could comprehend. In the span of a single lifetime, a nation of farmers became a nation of factories. Young men and women who would once have inherited the family land instead boarded trains for the cities, chasing wages in the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the slaughterhouses of Chicago, the garment lofts of New York. They lived in crowded tenements, far from the villages where their parents grew old. The farm that had guaranteed a dignified old age was now hundreds of miles away, and often there was no one left on it. Picture what this meant for a single family, repeated millions of times over. A father and mother work a farm their whole lives, expecting, as their own parents had, that the children will stay, inherit the land, and care for them at the end. But one by one the children leave, for the factory, for the city, for the promise of a paycheck the farm could never match. The old couple is left alone on land that has grown too much for them to work, and when the husband dies, the widow cannot manage the farm at all. She sells it, or loses it, and moves to the city to live in a spare room in her son's crowded apartment, a guest in a home that is already straining to feed the children living in it. The intimate, guaranteed security of the farm has been traded for a fragile dependence on a wage earner who is himself one layoff away from ruin. This was the quiet catastrophe hidden inside America's rise. Industrialization did not just build wealth, it scattered families across a continent, and in doing so, it shattered the oldest retirement system humanity had ever known, because the factory had no place for an old man. On the farm, a man could slow down and still contribute, but the assembly line demanded speed, strength, and endurance. When a worker's hands grew slow and his back gave out, the factory did not ease him toward the porch. It simply replaced him. There was always another young immigrant at the gate, ready to work for the same wage. A lifetime of labor earned a man no loyalty, no pension, no thanks. One day he was told he was too old, and the next he was standing on the street with nothing, and nothing was very nearly what awaited him. Consider the arithmetic of survival for an aging industrial worker in 1900. He had no savings worth the name. Wages were low, and life was expensive, and there was rarely anything left to set aside. He almost certainly had no company pension. In that year, the number of American companies offering their industrial workers a retirement pension could be counted on the fingers of one hand, barely a handful in the entire nation. And even those rare pensions were fragile things, granted at the pleasure of the employer and just as easily taken away, so that a man could give a company 30 years and still be turned out with nothing if he displeased the wrong manager in his final years. As late as 1932, only about 15% of the workforce had even the possibility of a job-related pension, and in reality only about 1 in 20 elderly Americans was actually receiving one. For the other 19 out of 20, old age was a financial cliff with no railing. There were faces behind those numbers. The widow who had spent her life keeping a home and raising children, and who now, with her husband gone, had no wages of her own to point to and no claim on anyone. The immigrant laborer who had crossed an ocean for the promise of American work, only to discover that the work did not want him once his strength was spent. The aging craftsman whose skill had been made worthless by a new machine and who watched younger men operate it for a fraction of his old pay. These were not the reckless or the idle. They were the people who had built the country. And the country, when they grew old, had no plan for them at all. So how did they survive? They cobbled together survival from whatever they could find. Some moved in with their grown children, crowding into small apartments, a solution that worked until the children themselves fell on hard times. Some leaned on their churches or on the fraternal lodges and mutual aid societies that working men paid into during good years, hoping for a little help in the bad ones. Some kept working until the very day they died, because stopping was not an option. The old clerk, the aging night watchman, the gray-haired laborer taking whatever light work he could still find. And some took in boarders, or did piecework, or quietly slid into poverty so deep it had no bottom. Hi viewers, do you think growing old was harder back then, or in some ways simpler than it is today? Tell us in the comments. But when every one of those options failed, when there were no children, or no money, or no strength left to work, there remained only one place for the destitute old to go. And it was the place they had dreaded their entire lives. They called it the poorhouse, the almshouse, the county home. The names changed from town to town, but the meaning was the same, and it was spoken in a whisper. It was where you ended up, when you had truly nothing and no one. There was even a grim old saying, passed down in songs and family warnings, that a person who had run out of luck was headed over the hill to the poorhouse. It was not a metaphor. There were real buildings in nearly every county in America, waiting to receive the human wreckage of a system that had no other plan for the old. To enter one was to surrender almost everything that made a life your own. Many were run as working farms, where even the frail were expected to labor for their keep, tending crops and livestock to feed the very institution that housed them. Families were often separated, husbands from wives, sent to different wings or different buildings entirely. Residents, called inmates, the same word used for prisoners, lived under the authority of an overseer, ate what they were given, and slept where they were told. In many places, entering the poorhouse meant losing the right to vote, stripped of citizenship itself as the price of a bed and a meal. Conditions ranged from merely bleak to genuinely horrifying, with the sick, the insane, the orphaned, and the simply old thrown together under one leaking roof, tended by staff who were rarely trained and often indifferent. The dread of the place ran so deep that it seeped into the language of everyday life. Parents scolded extravagant children by warning they would drive the family to the poorhouse. It appeared in popular songs and ballads as the destination of the ruined and forgotten, and it was no idle threat, because everyone knew someone, a neighbor or a relation, who had made that final journey and never come back. To be old and poor in America was to live with the constant, quiet arithmetic of how close you stood to that door. This was the shadow that fell across the final years of the American poor. Not a rocking chair on a family porch, but a cot in a county institution, your dignity confiscated at the door. The fear of it was so powerful that it haunted the American imagination well into the 20th century, a fear that some who lived through it carried to their graves. And here is the bitter irony buried in this story. America had already proven, decades earlier, that it could do far better. It had already built a vast machine to keep hundreds of thousands of aging citizens out of exactly this misery. The country simply chose not to remember it. For this fragile, frightening patchwork of family, charity, and the dreaded poorhouse held together, just barely, through good times. It depended on children who had jobs, on churches with full collection plates, on an economy that at least gave the young a fighting chance to support the old. But what would happen if all of that collapsed at once? If the jobs vanished, the savings evaporated, and the children found themselves as desperate as their parents? What would become of the old then, when the entire safety net, every last thread of it, was torn apart in a single catastrophic blow? America was about to find out. The blow came in October of 1929. The stock market collapsed, and with it, the confident world of the 1920s. But the Great Depression that followed was not a single event. It was a slow, grinding descent that reached into every corner of American life, and for the nation's elderly, it was a special kind of ruin. Consider what the Depression did to an old person specifically. A lifetime of careful saving, of pennies set aside in a local bank, could vanish overnight when that bank failed, and thousands of banks failed, taking the savings of the thrifty and the cautious down with them. The modest nest egg that was supposed to carry a couple through their final years was simply gone, erased by forces they could not see and did not cause. Decades of discipline wiped out in an afternoon. And the family safety net, already fraying, now snapped completely. How could a grown son support his aging parents when he had lost his own job? How could a daughter take in her mother when she could not feed her own children? Unemployment climbed toward 1 in 4 workers. The young, who had always been the last line of defense for the old, were now drowning themselves. The whole intricate system of families quietly carrying their elders collapsed under a weight no family could bear, and there was a particular cruelty in how the Depression struck the old. A young man who lost his job in 1932 could at least tell himself that the economy would recover, that there would be work again someday, that he had years ahead of him to rebuild. An old man had no such comfort. He did not have years to wait for recovery. His working life was already behind him, his strength already spent, his savings already gone. For him, the collapse was not a setback to be weathered. It was final. He had done everything right, worked hard, saved what he could, raised his children to stand on their own, and it had all been swept away in forces he could neither predict nor resist. The Depression did not just impoverish the elderly. It humiliated them, turning a generation of proud, self-reliant Americans into supplicants at the doors of their own children, their churches, and finally the county. By the depths of the Depression, more than half of America's elderly were living in poverty. Not struggling, not pinching, impoverished. An entire generation that had built the modern nation, laid its rails, raised its buildings, worked its factories, now faced the end of life in destitution, and the poorhouses began to overflow. A few states had tried, in the years before the crash, to build their own small old-age pension systems, but the Depression turned those fragile experiments into cruel jokes. As desperation swelled the number of elderly seeking help, the very tax revenues meant to fund the pensions collapsed along with the economy. States responded not by expanding aid but by slashing it, cutting the monthly payment, refusing to enroll new pensioners, and in some places suspending the checks altogether. In California, the number of people drawing a state pension more than tripled in the space of a few years, even as the amount each one received was cut. The states could not save their old. The problem was simply too big, and it was everywhere at once. It was into this desperation that a single letter to a newspaper lit a fire that would reshape the country. In September of 1933, in Long Beach, California, a retired doctor named Francis Townsend sat down and wrote to his local paper. Townsend was in his 60s, out of work himself, a quiet man with no political machine and no fortune, but he had, by his own account, been shaken to his core by a sight outside his window: elderly women, dressed in rags, picking through garbage cans in search of something to eat. In a nation this rich, he could not accept it, and so he proposed something audacious. The government, Townsend wrote, should pay every American over the age of 60 a pension of $200 every single month. There was just one condition. They had to spend all of it, within the month, putting the money straight back into the economy. It would rescue the old from poverty and, he believed, spend the entire country out of the Depression at the same time. The scale of the promise was staggering. $200 a month was more than twice what the average American worker earned while still on the job. To the desperate elderly of 1933, it did not sound like a policy, it sounded like salvation, and the country caught fire. Townsend clubs erupted across the nation, first in California, then everywhere. Old people who had never been political in their lives now gathered weekly in church halls and living rooms, organizing, petitioning, singing Townsend songs, and demanding their pension. At its peak, the movement claimed thousands of clubs and roughly 2 million dues-paying members, close to 1 in 5 Americans over 60. Petitions bearing millions of signatures poured into Washington. Public opinion surveys found that a majority of all Americans supported the plan. What had begun with one heartbroken doctor and one letter had become one of the largest grassroots movements in the nation's history. It even reached the floor of Congress. A California congressman introduced a bill built on Townsend's idea, forcing the nation's lawmakers to reckon directly with the demand. The plan's economics were shaky. Critics from every part of the political spectrum tore into the math, pointing out that the modest tax Townsend proposed could never fund benefits so enormous. The bill itself would ultimately fail. But that was almost beside the point. The movement had already done its work. It had taken an idea that just a few years earlier had lived only on the fringe, the notion that Washington owed its elderly citizens a monthly check, and dragged it into the absolute center of American politics. And it terrified the most powerful men in Washington, including the president. Because here is the truth that upends the story most Americans think they know. Franklin Roosevelt did not dream up Social Security in a burst of pure benevolence and hand it graciously down to a grateful people. He was pushed, hard, from below. The Townsend movement, along with the fiery Share Our Wealth crusade of Senator Huey Long, was applying enormous pressure from the populist flank, and Roosevelt knew it. His own Secretary of Labor recorded him saying, plainly, that Congress could not withstand the pressure of the Townsend Plan unless the administration offered a solid old age plan of its own. Social Security was not only a gift of conscience, it was, in part, a calculated maneuver to head off a revolt. And there was a second forgotten truth, even more astonishing. America had already run an enormous old age pension system once before, and then erased it from its own memory. After the Civil War, the federal government began paying pensions to Union veterans. What started as compensation for the war-wounded expanded, decade after decade, into something vast, a de facto old age pension covering a huge share of the North's aging men and their widows. By the 1890s, these Civil War pensions had swelled into the single largest expense in the entire federal budget. In 1 year, they consumed roughly a third of all federal spending. At their height, this system supported nearly a third of all the elderly people in the North. The machinery to guarantee dignity in old age had existed, the precedent was real. And then the veterans died off, the program faded, and the nation somehow forgot it had ever known how to do this at all. So the desperate elderly of the 1930s were not asking for something unimaginable. They were asking for something America had already done and abandoned. Faced with the Townsend uprising and a nation in crisis, Roosevelt acted. In 1934, he created the Committee on Economic Security and placed it in the hands of a woman who would become the true architect of American security in old age, his Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins. She was the first woman ever to serve in a president's cabinet, a reformer forged years earlier by a single afternoon of horror. As a young woman in New York, she had been having tea nearby when the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory caught fire, and she rushed to the scene in time to watch young garment workers, trapped behind locked doors on the upper floors, leap to their deaths on the pavement rather than burn. She never forgot it. She spent the rest of her life fighting for the people the economy chewed up and discarded, and she had agreed to join Roosevelt's cabinet only on the condition that he let her pursue exactly this kind of sweeping social protection. Now she was charged with building a permanent floor beneath American life. But to build that floor and get it through a divided Congress, Perkins and Roosevelt would be forced into a bargain, a compromise so dark that it would quietly slam the door on millions of Americans, most of them black, locking them out of the very security the nation was about to celebrate as a triumph for all. The problem was the American South. Roosevelt's New Deal depended on the votes of powerful Southern Democrats, men who chaired the key committees in Congress and who held a single, non-negotiable condition. They would not support any program that disturbed the racial and economic order of the South, an order built on the cheap, controllable labor of black farm workers and domestic servants. And so, as the Social Security bill moved through Congress, a fateful line was drawn. The new old age insurance would not cover agricultural laborers. It would not cover domestic workers, the maids, the cooks, the housekeepers. On its surface, the exclusion mentioned no race at all, but everyone in the room understood exactly what it meant. In the South, those two categories, farm labor and domestic service, were the jobs held by the overwhelming majority of black workers. By excluding those occupations, Congress excluded roughly 2/3 of all black Americans from Social Security and up to 80% of black workers in the South. The same stroke shut out vast numbers of women of every race who filled the nation's domestic jobs. Frances Perkins herself objected. So did others in the administration, who argued the program should cover as close to everyone as possible. But the political price of universal coverage was the death of the entire bill. The dream of security for all was sacrificed, in part, to win the votes needed to secure it for some. The nation's leading civil rights organization saw exactly what had happened, condemning the new law as a sieve with holes deliberately sized to let black Americans fall through. That was the hidden cost, sewn into the very fabric of the promise. And there was one more design choice. This one made not from prejudice, but from cold political genius. Roosevelt insisted that Social Security be funded not from general taxes, but from a dedicated payroll tax, deducted directly from workers' paychecks and matched by their employers. Economists told him this was clumsy, but Roosevelt understood something they did not. By making every worker pay in, he was giving every worker a personal stake, a receipt, a claim, a moral right to the benefits they had funded with their own money. He reportedly explained that those taxes were never about economics, they were about politics. With their contributions on the record, no future politician would ever dare to scrap the program, because the people would rise up to defend what they had already paid for. He was building the system to be permanent, unrepealable, bolted to the American soul. On August 14, 1935, Franklin Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act into law. Critics howled that it was socialism, un-American, a fatal blow to self-reliance and thrift. In the Senate, one lawmaker pressed Frances Perkins directly, demanding to know whether the whole scheme wasn't socialism, and when she said no, he pressed again, asking if it wasn't at least a teeny-weeny bit of socialism. Business groups warned that taxing paychecks to fund pensions would cripple the economy and sap the American character. Some argued, as critics of every safety net always have, that people should simply save for their own old age, as though the Depression had not just proven, in the cruelest way imaginable, that a lifetime of saving could vanish through no fault of one's own. But the law stood. In 1937, the payroll taxes began to flow. The Supreme Court, which had struck down other New Deal programs with a cold hostility that had frightened the entire administration, this time upheld the act. And America had, at last, made a promise to its old. The floor was finally built, but it had a hole cut into it, on purpose, and it would take decades of struggle before the millions first left standing in the cold would be allowed to step onto it. For years, the promise was only a promise, with taxes collected but no monthly checks yet flowing. And then, on the last day of January in 1940, the future arrived in the form of a single envelope, mailed to a modest home in Ludlow, Vermont. Her name was Ida Mae Fuller. She was a legal secretary, retired, unremarkable in every way except one. She happened to be the very first American to receive an ongoing monthly Social Security check. Over 3 years, she had paid a total of just under $25 into the system. Her first check was for $22.54. It was a small sum even then, but it was everything. It was a check that arrived not as charity, not as a handout from an overseer at a poorhouse door, but as a right she had earned, mailed to her own home with her own name upon it. Ida Mae Fuller lived to be 100 years old. By the time she died, she had collected more than $22,000, a return on that tiny investment that captured, in one long human life, the entire revolutionary promise of the thing. And that promise transformed what it meant to grow old in America. The change was not subtle. In the years before Social Security, growing old and growing poor had been very nearly the same thing. A majority of the elderly ended their lives in want. In the decades after, that reality was turned on its head. Old age poverty, once the ordinary fate of the American worker, fell dramatically, until being old was no longer, by itself, a sentence to destitution. The transformation was so complete that it became invisible. Younger Americans grew up simply assuming that their grandparents would have something to live on, never knowing that this assumption was itself a hard-won invention, barely older than living memory. The poorhouse, that dreaded institution that had shadowed the final years of the poor for a century, began to empty and die. Over the following decades, as Social Security expanded, the terror of ending life as an inmate in a county home simply faded from American consciousness, until younger generations forgot it had ever existed at all. Some of those grim buildings were torn down. Others were quietly converted into ordinary nursing homes, their history erased, though the old people of that generation sometimes refused to set foot in them, remembering all too well what those walls had once meant. Old age was no longer an automatic sentence to poverty. For the first time in the nation's history, growing too old to work did not mean growing too poor to live. Today, that system pays benefits to tens of millions of Americans, and it remains the single most popular and enduring government program in the country's history, so durable that Roosevelt's prediction came true. No politician, of any party, has ever managed to dismantle it, because the people who paid into it will not allow it. It has become, exactly as he intended, untouchable. But the compromises struck in 1935 did not vanish. They echo still. It took until 1950 and beyond for farm and domestic workers, those black and female Americans deliberately excluded at the start, to finally be brought under Social Security's protection, decades of dignity denied that can never be returned. And the fault lines built into the program at its birth still run through American politics today. Every fierce debate over Social Security's future, over its solvency, over who pays and who collects, is an argument with the choices made in that room in 1935. There are things about it that most Americans still misunderstand. They imagine Social Security as a personal savings account, their own money held in trust and returned to them. It has never been that. It is something more radical, a promise between generations, in which the taxes of today's workers pay for today's retirees, exactly as tomorrow's workers will one day pay for them. It is a chain of mutual obligation stretching across time, binding the young to the old and the old to the young. It is why the program's health depends not on a vault of saved money, but on the simple ratio between those working and those retired, and why every shift in that balance sparks another round of anxious debate, and it was not handed down by a benevolent government. It was forced up, from below, by desperate people who refused to accept that growing old in America should mean growing afraid. That is the forgotten truth of how America learned to grow old. The check your grandparents lean on was born out of fear, the fear of the poorhouse. It was forced into being by the desperate, led by a small-town doctor the history books nearly erased. It was built on a precedent the nation had forgotten it possessed. It was engineered, deliberately, to last forever. And it was stained, from its first day, by a bargain that left millions of Americans behind. So here is the question worth sitting with. Was Social Security the government's finest achievement, a moral floor beneath human dignity, or a promise the nation may one day struggle to keep? And when you grow old, would you rather depend on your own family, as Americans once did, or on the strength of a promise made by the whole country? There is no easy answer, and the people who lived through the world before it would not all agree. Tell us what you think in the comments, because the fight over what we owe the old has never truly ended. And this is only one of the invisible systems that quietly shapes your entire life. Because there was once a time in America when growing old wasn't the only thing that could destroy you, when a single illness, a single hospital visit, could bankrupt an entire family in a matter of days. There was no Medicare, no health insurance as we know it. A broken leg or a difficult birth could wipe out everything a family had built. So how did ordinary Americans survive getting sick before health insurance existed? And who decided that a nation this powerful should let its people gamble their lives against their savings? That story is coming next, and it will change the way you see every medical bill you have ever received.